Hello, and thank you for joining us today as we kick off The Way Forward, a webcast series on disrupting dehumanization hosted by Forward Promise. Forward Promise is a national program that supports culturally responsive practices that buffer the negative effects of historical and systemic trauma on boys and young men of color. Hello, my name is Howard Stevenson, and I'm the co-director of Forward Promise, and I'm very excited about today. For communities of color, there are two pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. The successive dehumanizing deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd spotlight the systemic racism and racial trauma affecting people of color. Dehumanization, as Dr. Bryant will discuss shortly, is about a lie, a story, a false narrative that one needs in order to justify unjust distortion and violence of other people's beliefs, actions, and feelings. We believe at Forward Promise that this lie threatens the healthy development of boys and young men of color and their communities. We also believe that we must fight that narrative that says you and your people are not human. And because of that, I can do anything to you. But we are human. We believe, as one of our grantees, director of the Native American Community Academy in Albuquerque, Anpeo Duta Flying Earth says, we can't forget the genius in our communities. Because it is that genius that has relied upon history, upon culture, upon spirit and medicine, upon emotions, and upon our very bodies to heal, grow, and thrive. The Way Forward, a 5-pass webcast series, centers 5 dimensions of dehumanization as a foundation for systemic racism and racial trauma. Our panel of experts throughout the course of the series have presented ways to substantially disrupt dehumanization and affirm the full humanity of boys and young men of color. In today's episode, Justifiable Rage, Undeniable Tears, Disrupting the Dehumanization of Our Emotions, we will discuss how to embrace the genius in our communities. I'm so excited today to have our guests who will each give a 1-minute introduction. Dr. Rhonda Bryant, Dr. Tashelle Bourdaire, Mr. Dylan Nishimoto, Keith Miller, and Mark Chavez. If you could start, Dr. Bryant, introducing yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rhonda Bryant, and I am the co-director of Forward Promise and president and CEO of the Mariah Group. And so I'll also add to Howard's comments to say welcome to today's webcast.
Dr. Bourdaire.
Hi, I'm Tashelle Bourdaire. I'm a Forward Promise Fellow, proud Forward Promise Fellow, and assistant professor at the University of Missouri. My research area is African American bereavement, and particularly looking at disenfranchising losses like homicide in particular. Glad to be here and welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Nishimoto?
Hey, I'm Nishimoto. I am a clinical social worker and I work with Asian Counseling and Referral Service. In particular, I work with immigrant refugee communities in addressing the generational and the acculturation gap that many of these families face.
Mr. Miller, thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Miller. I'm the head of youth programs at the Deep Center. I do a few things in addition to focusing on healing literacies, focus also on village building and the ways in which we at the Deep Center use writing, art, and culture to fuel the creative fires of Savannah's young people and make the city a more just and equitable place. So happy to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you, Keith. And our final guest, Mark Chavez. Mr. Chavez.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you. I am Mark Chavez, the director and founder of Intertribal Youth, AKA Native Like Water. We're based in San Diego, California, with also programs internationally. I am also a proud fellow of Forward Promise, and our work centers on intergenerational healing amongst Native American high school age youth on up to adult, and again, incorporating the intergenerational knowledge that we have within our communities.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm looking forward to hearing what all you have to say. We also want everyone to use the chat to share what you're thinking and feeling with us so that we can engage as many people as possible. We see there are folks from all over the country who've already chatted where they're from Atlanta. We've got folks from Des Moines, Washington, I believe, and Seattle, Washington. So please let us know where you are, who you are. We're so excited to hear from you. Before we get started, or as we get started, I'm going to ask my co-partner and the next person who runs everything, Dr. Rhonda Bryant, Forward Promise, to give us a summary of the dehumanization framework before we get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Howard. So today's episode, I think, is really, really important because we're going to be talking about the dehumanization of emotions for people of color. And, every single day, people of color wake up to the reality that they live in a society that doesn't value them, that doesn't affirm their full worth, that doesn't recognize their humanity. And unfortunately, this is not new. It is a core underlying truth in American culture and society, and has been present since the very beginnings of our nation. And, the ugliness of how America has treated people of color for generations is a truth that's hard for some people to hear, but it doesn't make it any less real. People of color have really pushed to thrive in spite of these inhumane conditions for so very long. And to be honest, the emotional cost of that push is really, really high. The last several months living through COVID have been hard. Because we've had to see on full display the lack of respect and care for people of color who have literally been putting their lives on the line to save our country from both health and economic devastation. I mean, think about it. As you sit in your comfortable home office, your 401k balance is dependent on a person of color who decides to get up, leave their house, go to work in a hospital or at a COVID testing site in order to end this pandemic for good. But we have provided them with little or no protection or economic assistance. That is dehumanization. And at the same time, we're witnessing so many vile instances of murder, brutality, and profiling against people of color, where the perpetrators are getting off virtually unpunished. That is dehumanization. And in the face of all of these instances, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who are struggling under the weight of the private pain of these issues, because we live in a society that expects people to just suck up their grief and tuck it away. But how do you show up to school and function fully the day after it's announced that Breonna Taylor's killers will go unpunished? How do you show up to work and function fully when you realize that your life doesn't really matter because the president says, don't let coronavirus dominate you, but you've lost more friends, family, and coworkers to this disease than you can count on your two hands? That is trauma. And at Forward Promise, we're really concerned about the impacts of that trauma from racism and dehumanization on people of color, with a particular focus on how it impacts boys and young men of color. So we launched this webcast series to really increase people's understanding of what dehumanization is, how it shows up every day in our society, what is the trauma it creates, and how that trauma is impacting boys and young men of color and their potential for a bright, positive, and thriving future. So to do this, our work at Forward Promise has been to break down dehumanization into understandable bites for people. So to define the cycle of dehumanization in a way that shows people clear examples of how it's constructed through negative narratives about who people of color are, how it's implemented through dangerous actions toward people of color, both in daily treatment in society and in policies, and the impact that it has on people of color and society, both in terms of its direct harmful outcomes and also in terms of how people of color are blamed for their own struggles. And so we break down dehumanization into these 5 domains: historical, cultural, spiritual, social, emotional, and physical. So I'll briefly define the 5 domains just to provide context for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. We've done full webcasts on the first 3 of these, which are available on our YouTube page for folks to go back and to view. The first is historical dehumanization, which is defined as the thoughts, feelings, and actions that have led to the mass destruction, punishment, or control of land and people. And it's a part of the history of our country from its very beginning. The second is cultural and spiritual dehumanization, which we define as the thoughts, feelings, and actions that demonize, disregard, devalue, or marginalize the cultural and spiritual practices of people of color, relegating them to unimportant. The third is social dehumanization, which we define as the thoughts, feelings, and actions that either divert resources or fail to invest resources into communities of color, and also restrict the rights of these communities in the social, educational, and legal arenas. The fourth area, emotional dehumanization, which is the focus of today's webcast, we define as the thoughts, feelings, or actions that limit expressions of empathy towards communities of color and demonize these communities for their outcry in the face of negative experiences. So I'm sure we'll get into a lot of different areas of how that occurs in today's conversation. And the fifth area, physical dehumanization, are the thoughts, feelings, and actions that place the physical bodies of members of communities of color at risk of harm. All of these forms of dehumanization carry messages, messages that boys and young men of color internalize and carry with them in their daily living. If you can imagine what it's like to carry harmful internal messages because of physical or emotional abuse that you might have received in childhood, because a classmate or a family member, or worse yet, a parent didn't like you, then you can relate to this. And so imagine experiencing daily emotional abuse all of your life simply because of the color of your skin. What harmful messages do you think that would cause you to carry? And this is what we see our boys and young men experiencing day in and day out. There are researched and very specific health implications from the trauma of racism and dehumanization that we don't talk a lot about and that society doesn't take accountability for. You know, things like high blood pressure, higher levels of stress hormone in the body, depression, poor sleep habits, higher body mass index. There is data that clearly links the trauma of racism and dehumanization to these very physical manifestations in the body. Now imagine generation after generation of this in a family, in a community, simply because of the color of your skin or the country from which you've immigrated. What I look to for hope is the healing medicine of love that is inside our communities of color. The way that we love on each other to ease the stress and the pain of dehumanization. It's a strength that nobody can touch. And while we fight for a society that sees our humanity, we take positive steps to affirm our humanity in each other as an act of resistance. And so in today's webcast, I'm so happy that we're going to bring this conversation to the forefront because we don't talk a lot about the emotional strain that dehumanization places on us. But we're also going to share with the world some of the solutions that we have created in our own communities to combat this so that we can heal, grow, and thrive in spite of how our society currently functions. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation, Howard, and I know that our panelists are going to give us a lot of rich information to take with us.
Fantastic, Rhonda. Actually, as you're talking, before we go to the panelists, I just want to, I don't know if you remember when we first started at Forward Promise and we were creating this framework several years ago. I mean, listening to you talk about it, it seems so huge in a sense of how many different areas that you know, not only a foundation or community service agency has to address, but it seems sometimes overwhelming. And I'm thinking, if you're looking back when we first started, you know, and now, how have you seen this framework change over time? Have you any thoughts about that, where we began to where we are right now?
You know, I think the richness of how we've developed the framework has been hearing from people so that we could make those changes along the way. Um, I feel like for anybody, talking about dehumanization feels like such a huge, mammoth problem. And so I think that the best thing that we have been able to do is to break it up into these bite-sized pieces for people so that people can talk about them one at a time. Mm-hmm. But you're right, the idea that all of this is swirling in the atmosphere, in society, in our respective communities, in our households, it is huge.
Yeah.
But I'm grateful for the ways that we've been able to talk about it, because I've had people come to me and say, you have put words to what our experience has been for generations. Mm-hmm. You've put it in a way that makes it digestible and it helps me to then explain it to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate you've traveled so many different places, and so have I. Talking about the framework and what you've heard from people is really powerful. I remember hearing, initially when we started that since we are a community that's caring about Black and Brown folks that have different histories, right? How do we encapsulate, how do we include all those histories that isn't in one type of oppression? So, folks were telling us racism is important, but also colonialism is important, right? And dehumanization was a way for us to try to capture everybody's narrative and history without diminishing anyone. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that too.
Right. I think what has been good too has been to find both the commonalities and the differences in that history. When we did the historical dehumanization webcast, for example, so many people said, I learned so much about other cultures, mm-hmm. but now feel so much more connected to our histories as a result of the conversation, because, we have a shared experience across all of these different cultures of having to navigate dehumanization, and the storylines are different, but the impact that it's had on our souls has been the same, I think. And being able to share that with one another and to find kinship in that has been powerful.
Absolutely. I was very upset years ago when the president talked about Mexicans in a pejorative way. And that, in many respects, besides being a dog whistle, it was a dog whistle and a statement for all of us to realize that if you're talking about somebody else, you're coming for us next. And so in some respects, we need to start early to think about how we all have even with those different histories, how can we learn from each other to battle something that has been here for centuries and still wants to thrive even to this day. Right. So in many respects, I don't know if you have other comments.
That person as your brother and your sister still,
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. So there are ways in which white supremacy is trying to also divide and conquer us. And so by embracing these different perspectives and histories, we have a chance to do something about it. And I'm so glad our panelists today, as we think about this framework and invite you in at this point, maybe I'll start with Tashelle. When you see this framework, the thoughts that come to your mind about in the work that you're doing around dehumanization, how that's relevant or useful?
Oh, absolutely. I want to say that this framework is a significant contribution to understanding the experience of people of color. And what I hear is just intersectional forms of oppression happening all at the same time, right? And so my background is loss and bereavement, which is a part of each one of these aspects of dehumanization, really, right? But when a loss is or a form of dehumanization is I guess I'll say, and I apologize, it's so much. Just as a Black person listening to this framework, to be honest with you, it's hard to separate myself from it. I couldn't stop shaking my head while Dr. Bryant was speaking, and so I'm gonna acknowledge my humanness for 2 seconds, and I needed a moment to just take that in again. This isn't just content to us. This is real life for people, and so what Dr. Bryant just described is a number of very complex cumulative losses. So our ability to respond to each one gets compromised, right? So we can look at them separately, but if we look at them in their totality, what we're talking about is very complex bereavement for black people, right? Very complex losses. Each time she's described the type of dehumanization that people carry with them every day of the week. There is no break from these aspects of dehumanization that she so eloquently outlined. And so I guess I want to say also that when a person is dealing with multiple forms of marginalization, your ability to cope with each one is challenging. So that's why I brought up intersectionality. Because in some regards, we can't really separate our emotional self from our physical self, from in terms of looking at these dimensions. And so I guess I want to just add and just reiterate that it is very challenging. It is a major source of bereavement. When we look at loss, grief is kind of defined as this separation distress. And as I look at this model, and the more I hear about it, it's just like, oh my, this thing is so deep, right? This model. What I'm seeing as Dr. Bryan and Dr. Howardson have talked about this model is that there is also a separation. There's grief with separation distress from parts of ourselves each time we get dehumanized, and there's grief within that, right? The grief of having to emotionally regulate just to go to work, to the emotional toll of having to navigate in all of these spaces in which you're viewed as less than or being dehumanized. And so I guess I just want to say that I guess I want to say one other thing about these losses is that they're also ambiguous because there's no end to them. So when we deal with all of these different losses that are ambiguous, that don't have a clear-cut ending, stresses related to dehumanization, there's no end in sight, right? We've been dealing with this, as Dr. Bryan started out by saying, historically, right? And so when we see them continuing with no end in sight, right? The trials that are going on, no end in sight, right? We have to wait for the verdict. Families just don't go to the funeral and then start their grief process when a law enforcement officer harms a person. They're now having to prolong this whole process while they're waiting for a verdict for the trial, right? So it's just never ending. And so when losses are ambiguous, we're constantly waiting. There's no endpoint. That also really compromises the ability of people of color to be able to function on a daily basis. So we have so many incredible minds here. I want to stop there, but I did want to add like the kind of grief component to this very complex theory that very well describes the really complicated grief that we see among people of color.
Thank you, Tashelle. I actually want to come back to the notions of cumulative and ambiguous. I'm going to go to Dylan. What are your thoughts about the framework and or how you think about it in your work?
Yeah, as you're going through each of those dimensions, I think all of us, I know for myself, you were just kind of pointing out and thinking about and reflecting on different examples of each of those things, and then how each of the examples was coming up, and then just coming into each one was like, well, then there's also the physical and the emotional and the historical, and it all is intersectional is the right word there, and it does wrap all together. In my work with young people, school-aged boys and young men of color, a lot of that is forgotten about, or the experience of young people is distilled into success at school. Are you following rules? Are you going to class? Are you getting good grades? And that, to me, is the dehumanization part of just being a young person. Is that they're forgetting, or at least ignoring, the parts about all of the different sources of trauma that you have outlined here, and that I think we just need to call to a lot more attention to the fact that we're being asked to show up to school, do assignments, and do all this work, and surviving through, or trying to survive through, a pandemic, trying to survive through systemic racism, trying to survive through everything else that's going on around us.
Mm-hmm. You're bringing up children just adds to the drama. And I was thinking of what Tashelle was saying. I was thinking of families, and then you're bringing up children adds another dimension. I'm going to go to Mark now and see, Mark, what are your thoughts about dehumanization?
Well, yes, this is something that's quite a trigger. That's like Tashelle said, no end in sight. And then we look backwards, even with the pandemic, and some folks forgetting, the pandemics that took place amongst the Native American generations that wiped out millions of people. And it's so real. These massacres that took place to depopulate us, and the schools and the prisons that were created particularly for Native Americans to dehumanize or de-Native Americanize or de-indigenize or deculturalize our way of being. So a lot of this, of course, hits home and hits to our hearts and to our emotions and sets off this trigger. However, helping put this framework in our minds and to recognize it, I think for a lot of folks, they had not thought about that, non-people of color particularly, that it's gotten that deep that we weren't human. And in my work, I do a lot with kind of what we call environmental justice, or things in regards to the environment. And I always point out that everybody's very conscious of and quick to kind of save these natural environments, whether it be save the whales, the dolphins, these certain trees, and the human species, particularly the indigenous Native American human species, seems to be the last one in the conversation as far as our work in Southern California, where you have a very big population of people, yet the Native American is absent or is out of the conversation when it comes to the environment, especially now with climate change and us trying to look at solutions for that. I'm having to interject the traditional that we have, the contribution that we have, the human is to bring us into that to probably give. So, this it's where is the end point, and it's a real tough thing, and kind of like Tashelle said, the human side of me just having to have this trigger and swirl around all the time, just as a professional in a daily basis, and how that affects my health, how it affects our colleagues' health, and the youth on how that affects their health, and having to put that kind of in place. But there is a positive side. I think we're going to get to that positive side in a little bit. So
we're going to get to that in about in the second half of our program. But I'm still interested in it's come up from most of you, the sense that I live dehumanization. We live dehumanization. Our people carry it with us in our very beings. And sometimes I've noticed, when you get knowledge about your condition, you are overwhelmed by it, right? I did not realize how much I have had to navigate just to be in this world. And Keith, in your work, how do you think about dehumanization, given what our colleagues have already said?
Yes, I think what's so powerful about this is I kind of think of it through the idea of nightmares, right? So I want you to think about the worst nightmare that you could imagine. And I think of, for people of color, what we're forced to do is that in a lot of these nightmares, as humans, is a fear of not being able to protect those you love, a fear of not being able to speak, not being able to be heard, not being able to move, not being able to see. But the thing about that is that nightmares are dreams. You can wake up from them. I think what this dehumanization framework shows is that people of color can't wake up. And not only are we not allowed to wake up, we're forced to continually stay under, to experience all of these things that rob us of the ability, and for hundreds of years, for the ability to do what is right as human, which is to live and to exist. And so when we're thinking about, I even think about the privilege of dreaming in the state of a nightmare, where some people get the right to wake up and some aren't allowed to. And so in the work that we do at the Deep Center, we work with young people, young adults, but we also work with the villages that surround and support them. A lot of the work I think about is that there are these narratives and these toxic realities that we are forced to undergo and experience. We're not allowed to speak, not allowed to be seen. We're silenced, erased from history, literally, and forced to envision this idea of white supremacy as the only way to get ahead. In the work that we do, though, we lean on that art and social justice and culture to show us what we have always been, even though everything around us tries to say that we don't have the right to breathe, we don't have the right to be safe in our own homes or protect our very own bodies. And so what we use art to do is art allows us to speak across modes, speak across mediums, across outlets. It allows us to center the culture that we are born with in our very blood, what the body knows, so that we can then speak in ways that not only are we heard, but we're felt. And I think at the end of the day, what this dehumanization framework does is it gives us a language to be able to name the very thing that we have all felt for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that has impacted us in some way or another, but has also robbed other individuals who are not of color from being able to bear witness of the greatness that is what it means to be human. And so the final thing I'll say is, in having language and being able to speak, it allows us to be able to dream beyond what pain looks like. And what I love about is the Forward Promise has this language around healing, growing, and thriving. It's not enough for us to survive. Our communities are tired of surviving. Surviving is killing us. But in order for us to reach that pathway, that bridge to thriving, we have to understand as a nation, as a people, that structural violence against one group of people is structural violence against all. And so it's the work of all of us to be able to see ourselves and our humanity, have the right to dream and to exist together.
Wow, man, you're starting to redefine nightmares and dreams here, and what it means to be woke or not woke, I think. But also, I'm going to come back to you in this sense. We've been talking about 5 different types of dehumanization, and it's absolutely okay for folks to even critique the model. We're open in that regard. It might be some things we've missed, right? But there's also, some people might say, I get the historical stuff, right? Because I remember when something really bad happened and it's documented in Oklahoma, Trail of Tears. I get that. And I also get the whole idea about religious practices and cultures have been restricted and sort of oppressed. And even communities have been blockaded. But what about feelings? How don't people just have feelings? Why is feelings or emotions, how emotions dehumanize? And then Keith, can you start us off with that sense, and I'll go around to everyone else after.
Yes. So when we think about emotions, I always think about the ways in which bodies of color are incentivized to suppress our very emotions. So as a person of color, a badge of honor that I wrongfully thought was great was to grow up and to never be seen as angry, to never speak above a certain decibel, because my anger, as my mom taught me, had consequences, and the consequences weren't hurt feelings. The consequences was me being killed, having to ride in the back of a police car when I was 12 and slipping out of the handcuffs is an example of like never being able to voice or name those emotions. So when we're not allowed to feel, we're not allowed to do anything with any of these emotions. And so what ends up happening is I think we end up turning on ourselves and on each other. Because the trauma, because we have no language and nowhere to go, we begin to exist in a world of fatalism and we see it with our young people and work with them all the time. We're like, you believe that this is just what it is. And therefore, if this is what it's always going to be, why would I exist or believe different? And so one of the things that I think is important in art is art as allows us to name emotions that we have been told our entire lives we weren't allowed to feel. Imagine what it means to live and not be allowed to cry. I talk about it very often that, like, you know, at the age of 12, something happened to me and I wasn't able to cry for years. And what it does to your mental health, your physical health, but most importantly, your ability to empathize with those who are struggling with you. And because we never get the space to release, we're constantly having to suppress. Even in a moment of grieving, even a moment of mourning, we're not allowed to be angry. Even in work, even in a pandemic, we're shouldering all of the hopes and needs of everyone and still not allowed to speak. So I think it's one of those things that the body knows that it must release, and it's the inability to release and to feel that is killing, I think, all of us.
So our emotions our very emotions could be distorted or in a sense when expressed. And Dylan, do you have thoughts about emotions and why is that such a big deal?
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Dr. Stevenson. I think that for me, the thing that really comes up is the structure and the boxes that we are being and the expectations of how we are supposed to express our emotion. What is allowed? But for the API community, we have, you know, a long history of being scapegoated and being pitted against other communities of color as a model minority, and a model minority that, you know, doesn't make a fuss, doesn't speak up, doesn't cause problems. And I do take issue with the idea of calling it a model minority, because these are not things that are inherent to our cultures and our communities. These are things that other people in power have created the narrative for us to suppress and control other communities. So so there's not just not being able to speak up for some folks, but if you step out of that, then people are asking why. We have lots of other negative stereotypes or just stereotypes in general that are just not true. We have so if someone speaks up, then now people will have the narrative that of the angry person of color that is just always causing problems, I'm sorry, it's not making much sense anymore. But the issue I'm talking about here is that we're not only told that we can't make a fuss, but we have to make a fuss or display our emotions in only a particular way. And that's the only acceptable way of being able to share that.
Yeah, no need to apologize. I mean, I find myself sometimes when I'm thinking about these issues that I also am having memories kick in the middle of my conversation of times when stuff happened. And if I had my voice then, boy, if I could have said then what I'm feeling right now, it would be really powerful. So feel free, any of you at any point, if you're triggered, this is triggering for all of us. Don't be afraid to say, here's what's really going on in my head. I remember when such and such happened. Mark, do you want to throw in about feelings? Why is that such a big deal in your
Yes, well, I'm glad I'm not the only one thinking that, as well as tapping into my own emotions. And in our community where we suffer in silence. And we do decide to break the silence, a lot of times we're turning on each other. And that seems to be the time that we seem to show the bravado. It comes out on towards each other. And that's suffering in silence, and that suppressing those emotions also leads us to shy away from continuing higher education. We see that a lot, engaging with institutions or engaging with bridge building with other communities. And of course, probably the most prominent is leading to substance and alcohol abuse, which is rampant in our community. which that suffering in silence turns to that type of abuse where we can kind of continue to, falsely medicate those things.
Right.
And of course, personally, for me, it's been the same thing. It's been a lot of just suffering and silence and kind of alone. It's, even at a university or in a professional setting, when you are, 0.01% of the population, and who do you have to share
with? Right. Who do we have to share with? I mean, in some respects, we're going to talk about that in the second half, but suffering in silence is a different kind of emotional expression, is it not? Tashelle, you do this work on grief, and you must see so many different sides. You talked about cumulative and ambiguous and continuous. What in your mind, in your work, do you find what's so big a deal about emotions?
Some of the things that have been said really is that, I guess I want to reiterate, is it's central to be able to name our experiences, because when we can name our experiences, as overwhelming as they are, we can do something about them. We can go take a walk. We can know what we can figure out ways to cope if we can properly name what we are experiencing. When that gets taken away from us, then we start to channel it in other ways. I was thinking of some other ways in which people's emotions are can be dehumanized, and I think about when people are rightfully bothered by things in meetings, but can't really speak up, which again takes us back to this whole cycle that you all describe in your model, is that it takes us back to all of these other sources of dehumanization all over again, right? All of this extra emotional work that it takes to separate from yourself just to function. Children, we know that young children are disproportionately placed in special education classes, children of color, for engaging in normal behaviors, for displaying normal reactions to information that's presented to them, or normal reactions to that they're encountering throughout their days. And this is by like third grade, and children, once they're put in special education, rarely make it back to a typical classroom. And when they do, it's a grade level or two less than where they started. And so the costs and consequences are just so great when people's emotions are dehumanized. And we do see this differentially happening to people of color and white populations. Can I say one more thing? Because I'm so distressed. But I watch, and it's not like, I want the audience to understand, none of us are hoping, we're not wishing bad things on people who are white, on people who are male, on people who are, it's more of, can you understand what it's like to watch one person be arrested and choked? And I know we're going to get more into this. And then just literally on the news, just for an example that maybe people can visualize with us. This guy was like 6'4", who was just arrested. And instead of being tasered, and he was tackled, 6'4" guy who was white, he was tackled and then brought to a mental facility. Now, I bring that example up because people of color are tasered, beaten, and I know we're going to get more into this, and they might not even live to make it to the police car. And so any emotionality, if we're expressing how we're feeling or asking questions, we don't get to do. And questions are tied to emotionality, right? None of these things are separate again. But when they brought him to a mental health facility and I watched them gently pick him up, and he's 6'4", he should have been intimidating by all other means. Black people are described as big black, even if you're 4'2". So all of these different things just really his reactions were viewed as mental health issues, and then our reactions are viewed as, I don't even know, we're not viewed as human beings.
Aggressive.
I don't know. It's just a lot. Again, thank you for the model. It's so deep, so deep. And the model, if I'm correct, isn't it circular? And I don't even know if that was conscious or not, but like that's that whole symbol too of like the wheel that you created. Just is like, that is what people are going through. Like you want to, in terms of dehumanization.
Yes, absolutely. And you can think of it as also overlapping, not
Yes.
necessarily one after the other, right? So you could imagine some of you have been going into the area of your of physicality, right? How does suffering in silence affect my body? How do I embody this stuff in a way? You also bring up a lot of the neuroscience research, particularly around threat of Black people, brown bodies, brown spaces, brown voice, brown narratives, brown anything in a way that we've been talking about the emotions of people of color, but what about the emotions of those who are threatened by people of color as to how dehumanization occurs? And I don't know, Rhonda, do you have a comment that you'd like to throw in regarding this?
Yeah, because what it makes me think about as I hear you, Howard, talking about the emotions of people that are threatened, and Tashelle talking about the differences between the treatment of whites and blacks, is that our society doesn't think emotions in and of themselves are bad. Our society thinks that people of color displaying their emotions are bad. So white people are allowed to express emotions all the time. So their emotion of feeling threatened by us is considered valid. You know, so the white woman who calls the police on the man who's bird watching in the park, her emotions are valid, but his emotions are not. And I think a lot of that is rooted in the history of people of color being seen as, we are here to serve white people. Our existence is here for their benefit. So you don't get to express emotions because you're either here because we dominated your culture after we stole your land and now you work for us, or we brought you here as slaves to work for us, or you came over, as an immigrant and we put you to work for us. And so you just are here in service to white people, and your feelings do not matter. Your feelings about your condition or your station in life are unimportant as long as you do what it is we need you to do to keep our society running.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about what we're going to do about this, right, in the next hour. But as you were talking, Rhonda, I'm also triggered on the notion of if you look at some of the research on some receiving pain medication, right, that Black and brown folks are thought of based on a very old stereotype that somehow we experience pain very differently than other people. And because of that, and we talked about the framework as thoughts, feelings, and actions that turn into policies that maybe I'll give you less pain medication. Maybe I will punish you harder because you can handle it. How does that feel? Would you see that in the emotional realm as well? And anybody can speak up. You're only going to have a minute though, because we're coming up on a break in about 4 minutes. But do you have a thought about that? Because in some respects, if it becomes policy in my healthcare, what do I do about that? Or what do I feel about that, I guess?
I mean, one thing it makes me think about really quickly is just there's also whenever a young person communicates distress or disagreement in the school setting, they're automatically pegged as willfully defiant, which is one of the largest areas of discipline that you can do whatever you want. And it's stereotypical threat, like stereotype threat is like there, but also they're heavily medicated. I think about the many different ways in which boys and young women of color and girls and young women of color simply disagree. And the only way you can get back into that classroom is if you see this person who wants to.
I think Keith, you froze up on us. Okay, so while Keith is frozen, when he comes back, will anyone else have a comment or thought?
Hopefully we can get Keith back. But one thought I had was around medication and the treatment in hospitals of people of color is that asking for help or asking for more medication and in particular pain, some folks' minds might jump to the criminal behavior or that bias is already being put in and thinking that people were just out to get something. And that's something that I have seen and experienced myself is that people are like, that screening process of seeking medications has been there's more hoops to jump through.
Right. Absolutely. And we're almost coming up on the break. Anyone else want to throw in? I mean, honestly, the thing that stands out to me is the officer that murdered George Floyd. His seemingly lack of emotion, and also blindness and deafness to hearing this man call out for help, or his mother, or a host of emotional expressions, be turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to, as again, to summarize our sense of the scope of this kind of dehumanization, as well as the consequences in a world where we see folks who don't receive consequences, who can freely say and feel whatever they want to, even if it endangers the rest of us. That's a peculiar kind of arrogance. As Molefi Asante would say, it's the arrogance of not knowing what it is that they do not know, yet they speak and act as if they know what all of us need to know. That's a peculiar way to see other people. And with that, we're going to take a break because this is heavy. This stuff can, even as we talk about it. And when we come back, I can't wait to hear your other voices on this topic panel. Thank you so much. We are so blessed to have a doctor who heals other doctors in this space. Dr. Phyllis Hubbard is going to spend time with us. As Forward Promise, we realize Heal, Grow, and Thrive does not happen in a vacuum. We have to practice it. And Dr. Hubbard is going to help us stretch and breathe and recenter. And so thank you very much, Phyllis.
Thank you. Thank you for this incredible conversation. So we're going to do a quick stretch. I invite you to stand if you'd like. And the stretch is really going to help you get in contact with your emotions, because we do have to learn how to release emotions. And so what we're going to start with is our feet about shoulder width apart, tuck the tailbone under, and pull the shoulders up, back, and down. And we're going to take our right hand and lift it up to the sky or to the ceiling. And at the same time, push our left hand down to the floor. And you should feel a stretch on the side. So we're going to breathe in and we're going to reach up with the right hand at the same time, reaching down with the left hand. Feel that stretch. And as we exhale, we're going to switch sides. We're going to lift the left hand up and push the right hand down, and we're going to reach up as we breathe in and push down at the same time. We're going to try this one more time. This is to get us ready to release the emotions. Lift the right hand up and push the left hand down. Feel the stretch on the side, pushing and pulling at the same time. Good. And then switch sides, lifting the left hand up and pushing the left or the right hand down, pushing and pulling at the same time. Good. And then bring both hands to the chest and make a loose fist like so. And we're going to just pound the chest. This opens up the thymus gland. We're going to take 3 slow, deep breaths, and we're going to release with an ah. Really good for releasing tension that builds in the chest. We're talking about heavy stuff, all right? So let's take a deep breath in and exhale, ah. I can tell some of you were a little bit shy, so we're going to go a little bit deeper, all right? Let's take a slow, deep breath in. You don't have to worry. I can only hear myself. Exhale. Ah. Really get in there and feel that tension moving out of the body. One last time. Take a breath in. And exhale. Ah. Good. Really good to do when you're feeling stressed, and then lower the hands down. Take a slow, deep breath in and feel the energy moving through the body. Shake it out. And then you can come back and take your seat. And I invite you to try this practice several times throughout the day, and especially when feeling frustrated. So thank you so much. Take care, be well, and be radiant.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. Thank you very much. I feel better. Thinking on where we left off, and to continue, if we've all been triggered in this first segment or felt something or seen something in our heads that remind us of the breadth of the tragedy of emotional dehumanization, can we now consider what kind of solutions to get back to, due to Flying Earth's comment, what about the genius in our community? What about the things that we have from our own experiences, our cultural experiences that allow us to disrupt what we've been talking about? We're going to start first, though, with a video before we hear from our panelists regarding the work of Keith Miller and Deep Center as a way to also bring us back to this conversation on disruption.
My name is Keith Miller. I work at the Deep Center. I'm the head of youth programs. And I am from many places, but my hometown is Savannah, Georgia, from the ages of 6 until 15. We are approaching the west side, which is a side of town, at least especially when I was growing up, where you only came this way if you knew where to go and you lived here. I was raised growing up that success meant leaving your community and never coming back. So I did that. And then after almost 5 years, I felt compelled and called to come back home. I got tired of building healing-centered environments everywhere else but home. And Deep Center was particularly powerful because it was the first job I'd ever applied for where the number one thing they asked for was my art first and then my resume.
Deep Center uses arts and culture to help young people connect their learning to their lives to their communities, and their actions to transformational change. And we work with adults in their village, folks like public school teachers and probation officers, to make sure our young people are seen in their full humanity and to identify and advocate for policies that will make Savannah a more just and equitable place for young people and their families. First and foremost, we approach them with love and understanding and with an intentionality about listening to what their whole story is so that we can meet them at what their needs are. And we do not have a crime and punishment lens. We have a lens of love and restoration and support.
Sprinting towards homeland, and it's always the contestants are black, shot back, shot in the back because this pigment done seen too much light.
So part of our work when we're helping young people build critical literacy is to help them understand that those internalized narratives that they may be retelling themselves that are harming them are lies.
Black boy, hanging. Black boy, hanging. Who's gonna cut me down?
The three ways in which boys and young men of color are being dehumanized is the toxic narratives that criminalize them and that say that either they have done something wrong, will do something wrong, or by virtue of who they are wrong. Two, in the education system, any conflict, any friction, if it isn't complicit assimilation, it is you're kicked out of the classroom and you are not allowed to learn. And the third way is that literally the communities in which we've been raised in for years are now rapidly disappearing. And when we try to tell those stories, which is a lot of what we do in the Deep Center, our very memories are at stake just as our very bodies are unsafe.
For my interviewers, Boys II Men Barbershop is a Black-owned business that has been in the Starland District and has been able to see how it has changed over the years. You will be the ones asking the questions.
The number one lesson that we teach our young people is that storytelling is more than just words on a page, and that storytelling stops when the poem ends, when the painting is complete, or when you hold a workshop. In actuality, the storytelling begins as it continues through the connection to action.
She's too wet for your dreams. She step and select silhouettes is more than one blessed. Forget about the chest and her hips. Her mind was the prize and the gift.
I'm here to teach our kids how to understand the value of their story, to understand that their story is not just about writing it, but standing up and making sure that they can tell it. They can tell it in its full respect and pride and glory, and make sure that people, even when they don't want to listen, know that they should. The necessary part of what it means to heal and to grow and to thrive, as we've been learning.
I think often educational spaces are about keeping kids in rooms, in desks, controlling their bodies, and often controlling their minds. What DEEP does well is send our young people out into the world and make the world and the block the educational space. When that happens, they start to see the connections between their stories and the stories of those they bump into on the street, as well as history and current events.
All right, so where we are right now is we're in the Starland District. We're in the middle of a story that is waiting to be told.
During the time when I was raised, there was a lot more emphasis placed on respect. A great deal of emphasis placed on respect.
It's also crucial for Savannah to start seeing young people, especially boys of color, out in the world as learners and engaged citizens and leaders having these kinds of activities, so that Savannah too can stop and listen and learn from these young people instead of just talk about them.
So I wanted to have some of our young people talk to you guys about how long Boys II Men has been here, how you guys have seen the neighborhood change. They're gonna have their actual questions.
With the people whose hair you cut, do you build this sort of connection with them?
Yeah, most definitely. You gotta have a personal relationship with your clients and stuff. We have great locations, SCAD students coming around and stuff, and we have a whole bunch of walk-ins.
Thank you.
All right, no problem.
So when we're working with our young people, one of the activities that we always do is push them to write about something that they have never heard of, so create a brand new world, or we take them to very lived, experienced places, and we've asked them to reimagine the very buildings and the communities and the members that they see in front of them. Not because what they see in front of them isn't good, but because we want them to change their relationship with what they believe is possible. The boys and young men that I work with are powerful and beautiful in so many profound ways, but the one way that I keep being moved often to tears by is their willingness to still exist despite a society and a community that criminalizes them and sees them as a threat.
The boys and young men of color in DEEP are beautiful, lighthearted, joyful, playful, and complicated individuals that often, if they are empowered just to be in the room with people who have simple ideas about them, they will, just by being who they are, change the bad ideas that people have about them.
Their minds are so rich with what can be possible. And they're powerful because they can still dream, despite their physical bodies and their intellectual psyches being under attack at every second of every day. There's nothing that could be more beautiful and more powerful than seeing young men change what it means to be even considered a man by today's definition. What Forward Promise has taught us in teaching us about systemic dehumanization and giving us the Heal, Grow, Thrive framework and language is it allows us to bring something that's tangible, that's sound intellectually and can be felt to our community and our villages, and specifically our boys and young men of color. Because now we can say specifically what it means to actually know that trauma and healing are not separate. They happen at the same time, all the time. And because of that, we can have the ability to heal, to grow, and to thrive.
Welcome back, everybody. Wow, that was phenomenal. And I'm going to ask Keith you first. Two things stood out to me in this work, and kudos to Deep Center and the work you all are doing. Two of them. One is when you said what constantly brings you to tears. That's one thing about the humanity of the boys. And the other thing was the use of barbershops, right? And I think of in our work with barbers, the men, the Black men that we work with say to us often, there's very few places I can go where when I leave, I not only feel good about myself, but I look good too. And so in barbershops, there's a place to share your emotions in ways that you might not even share anywhere else. But what are your thoughts and reactions or additions you want to make to what we just saw or witnessed in regards to solutions for emotional dehumanization?
Yeah, I think oftentimes what's really important to know is there's so many examples about the pain, about what hurts, about how we're harmed, about the ways we're killed. But very rarely, and we know this from a media strategy thing, do they ever point out the fact that people of color have been and are still here. And I think when we begin to pay attention on the ways in which we're able to, simple places like the barbershop, the beauty salon, the basketball court, the library, these community places are where we are brought back to life often. We are reminded of our humanity because we see each other, we hear our stories, we look good, right? And what ends up happening is that we are able to produce counter narratives to these toxic narratives that say we shouldn't exist. And instead of not being allowed to be, we are encouraged to be. We are given language to speak up. We are able to, through these transformational relationships with the people in our barbershops, our churches, the school teachers who do speak power and truth into us and help us find our platforms, we then are able to see where we are in this larger nature of oppression. We are able to locate the humanity that we know we possess, and then we're able to bend those very narratives into examples of hope and what can exist. And then most importantly, in these barbershops, in these churches, in these libraries, we are able to step up, step out and speak. In those private conversations over the dinner table, on a stage in front of over 500 to 1,000 people, we're able to exist, sing, dance, be everything we have always been in the nature of healing.
So thank you. You're saying if I can be myself, that's one of the ways I can address this emotional dehumanization in all the ways that I be myself. Tashelle, do you have a comment about, or for the rest of our guests, our focus for the rest of the time is what solutions or strategies for disrupting emotional dehumanization have you found in your work to be important?
Opportunities, I know through my research in particular, and then I do programming in schools, but my research is intentionally designed to give space to tell narratives. And by the way, incredible film, Keith, and incredible work at Deep Center. To give people so that researchers and clinicians and people who will have direct interactions with them can hear the narrative. I kind of when people have an opportunity, so that myths are dispelled, right? We don't see enough examples of the strengths that are found among people of color, right? Narratives have been one way in which we've been able to survive, and so oftentimes when I'm sitting with a teenager or a young adult, for them it may that space outside of their family may be one of the few spaces they've had a chance to unpack. So through research, it's actually becomes therapeutic, although that's not my job. But it becomes some space for them to tell their narrative. And the only thing I'm going to say about that, if there are any researchers out there, we can get to any population if we establish rapport. I'm always trying to throw in that spiel. You can get to these Black youth, give people of color, indigenous youth, to give them some space to share their stories, get to know your gatekeepers in the communities, contact Forward Promise. And when people have a chance to tell their narratives, there's natural healing that goes with that. I always give participants a copy of the interview so that they can have that to keep their narrative as a reminder too. And I think that's very important in terms of ethical practice, but in humanizing people, give them that material back so they have their interviews in front of them. So I wanted to say that too, because people forget about the research side and the clinicians, but these are some ways we want to go full circle so that we can provide venues for healing through our work.
That's very ethical and very important. And I've always found too, like you, in a both and way, by bringing information to people or giving them the opportunity to tell their story, when other people don't want to hear their story, it's an intervention as much as we'd like it to be an assessment, and it ends up being an intervention. Thank you, Tashelle. Mark, in your work, strategies.
Yes, well, I'm glad we're here now. I'm glad we're here. I'm glad we're here now, being ourselves. This is just the switch from into the affirmation into the positive. I feel lighter already, and that has and also, you know, Forward Promise in disrupting the narrative. When this fellowship came into my life, reinforced the narrative. Everything we post, everything that we do is the celebration of life. Right now, where the dehumanization of them digging up our graves, our ceremonial sites and our cemeteries, which is happening right now as we speak, by putting that U.S. border there and in other locations across the Americas. But particularly right now, what is the opposite of this dehumanization? And it's us celebrating life. And that is what I kind of call in California, our coastal recreation, our recreation of who we are. And being on the ocean, being in the water, going ahead and stepping into these spaces that we can physically clock back to 20,000 years. So 10,000 years of being in these spaces along the beach in these affluent areas of San Diego, and then another 10,000 years prior to that that's covered with water. So we're talking about a 20,000-year-old story, which really dwarfs this whole colonial piece. That's kind of a blink of the eye, and getting into this space of this grandeur. And getting us back on the water. And if you go to nativelikewater.org and see some of our images and this narrative of us in our natural habitat, just returning to our natural habitat, our natural way of life, our natural state of being is really invigorating, not just me, but everybody that's partaking in that. Also, you could see another example of the indigenous Hawaiian culture, which is the Hokulea, which is what that movie Moana, if you've seen the Disney movie Moana, was inspired by. But this worldwide voyage on a double-hulled traditional canoe, just circling the globe, finding their way by the stars. And they did this and they came home a couple years ago after doing that, is an affirmation of our indigenous knowledge that, again, dwarfs this whole colonial narrative. And this is being us. This is being us. And I'm glad we're here now.
Thank you, Mark. You even seem lighter, man, as you're talking. It's great. Dylan, do you have some thoughts in the work you're doing about solutions?
Yeah. The parts that I really resonate with is finding the communities and spaces that young people already feel comfortable in being able to connect in. And Tashelle, what you were saying about finding the gatekeepers for communities, one of the things, so I work as a mental health clinician, and one of the major restricting factors is funding and staffing. But a big funder for mental health services and just medical services in general is Medicaid. And as a lot of people know, that it's just hard to get the care and help that we need. And it has to be defined by, like, accepted by something that's billable, or something that insurance providers or Medicaid will accept as and recognize as something that is beneficial. And so one of the things that we're doing right now with the support of Forward Promise and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is the development of a youth advisory board, and with the hopes of identifying and designing and developing a new ways and transforming healthcare systems that are both sustainable and more in line with what people are actually seeking. Not just that one-on-one counseling where we have to use CPT codes and have to use a very, very narrow definition of what healing and thriving looks like.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you very much. Rhonda, your thoughts about solutions and or anything you've heard so far you want to respond to?
So, Forward Promise, when we talk about solutions, we talk about 3 areas, and all of the panelists have touched on them. So I'll just kind of summarize for people. We talk about first, the solution of narrative change, and that really being focused on, with every opportunity that you have, finding a way to lift up the counter narrative, the truth about who our people are. So that may be in the media, it may be in your personal work settings, it may be in the grocery store. But as an individual, we have an obligation to lift up the true narrative of who people are and to tell a different story and to highlight humanity in places where people are being inhumane. And I think if it becomes a practice for each of us, it becomes something that can spread. Teaching one another, how do you look at situations and analyze them and identify the humanity and then give it voice? The second thing that we talk about in Forward Promise is this notion of creating safe spaces for our young people to heal from the dehumanization that's happening out in society. How do we create a safe space for them that teaches them to reject the notions of who society says they are and instead embrace the truth about who we know that they are? Keith talked about the young people at Deep Center being beautiful and being rich and having lots of great experiences and stories to share. How do we create a safe space where we are continually pouring that message into our young people and pushing out the negative message? And doing that for our whole families, actually, because what we find is that young people will take the strength that we've poured into them, into our youth programs, and then take it home. And then they will show their parents, you are beautiful, you are precious, you are valued. I learned this in this program, and now I'm bringing it home to you. And then the third thing that we talk about is the policy change. And Dylan lifted that up. When we think about Medicaid, we think about juvenile justice systems, we think about education systems, there are places and there are things that we can point to that intentionally dehumanize our children. So how do we turn that on its head through our advocacy? So I think about our grantee organizations, Native American Community Academy, for example, and how they have created a school that strips out all of the negativity of education and replaces it with a very positive, nurturing, loving, and academic setting. When we think about Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color, one of the organizations that's a part of our fellowship experience, and how they are teaching educators how to embrace humanity and to push out inhumanity in their work. So, those are the 3 pillars of solutions that Forward Promise is grounded in. And when we look to fund organizations, we're looking for organizations that do at least one of those 3 things.
Thank you, Rhonda. In many respects, go for it, Tashelle.
I want to add one other thing. Thank you, Rhonda. Y'all are also talented and eloquent. This is right on point, too. Y'all, please, if you're watching this, I hope that you will share this with other populations. This really is a safe space to acquire knowledge in a culture where that can be kind of challenging to obtain sometimes. So please share this video with other people. But I also wanted to say allyship is so key. And that's actually also a part of Forward Promise, like looking at systemic changes and how we might all be able to contribute to this, right? So we did highlight some of the scary parts about, the experience experiences of people of color, right? But also know that we also have just described some examples of hope and how these changes can happen very easily, right? Through figuring out like what is your area of privilege, right? What we're afraid of, that just simply means like something that you may or may not have been aware of that is working for you, but is not working for other people. So, sharing this video, that is being an ally, right? That is helping to inform other people who might wish to have this information but not have it. When you see opportunities to volunteer, Boys and Girls Club. If you're in Atlanta, Keith, right? Deep Center. And so there are so many different ways. Check out the Forward Promise website. So many resources there. And these are ways that you can be an ally. Because I know people are afraid of emotions, because unfortunately we live in a culture where we're taught everything except about how to deal with emotions, right? How to celebrate birthdays and how to party at, bar mitzvahs and all those things, but not to deal with loss, right? Not to deal with dehumanization. Yeah, this is hard stuff. But there are solutions, which we're trying to provide right now. So again, my hope is that you understand that we're not hopeless. We're simply trying to say these are the issues, because we have to talk about those. If you've been in a love relationship with your sweetie pie, y'all got to go through the hard stuff to get to this other piece, right? Honeymoon phase ends. And so that's all we're trying to say here. And how might you use these tools in this video and Forward Promise Fellow, Keats, all of these different places, Mark Chavez highlighted a website to be able to support our youth and go beyond apathy, right? So that they really do have the tools. When youth died to violence, you all, by 15 or 16, they've missed out on 60 years of life that they could have been contributing, when they could have been a grandfather or an uncle or a father, right? And contributing members to society. We all lose when we don't disrupt dehumanization. We're going to pay for it one way or another, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we all benefit and grow. Being an ally doesn't mean you're giving up anything. You're just trying to help not, facilitate a bill for people who die by violence, which goes into the millions every year to taxpayers. So if you're not doing it for the youth and you're just doing it for yourself, that's fine too. But you can contribute. There's always something that we can do. It's going to cost us. It literally costs money, right? When we don't support our youth. And disrupt dehumanization as promoted by Forward Promise. I just had to say, it was like coming out of my pores, out of my body. Like, yeah.
Yep. And we can feel it. I just want to make an announcement to everybody. We are open now for questions from the audience. Any questions for our panelists would be fantastic. And I'm going to go over to Keith and see if you have some thoughts, Keith.
Yeah, I think one really important thing to point out too is oftentimes when we're talking about young people, we think of them specifically as children. But what we've learned at the Deep Center is that we have the young people being trained as researchers. So from the program that you saw in that video to them doing and conducting community action-based research, to having an action research team that is literally developing political education modules to point out and break down oppression and the language that comes with it, to creating a Bill of Rights to be advocated for. It's super important that oftentimes, whether we mean to or not, systems often talk about young people instead of asking the young people what needs to change, because they already know. They are experiencing the brunt of it on a daily basis. So the understanding that young people are also doing everything from leading film. Even though COVID was happening, we led social distance filming that allowed young people to share their stories, share their research, share the data, but also interrogate these elected officials, ask for those promises, go out to the polls and make sure individuals are voting. All of these things are happening and can happen when we allow our young people to be in power. To understand that that is their role. It is not to stay in their lane. It is not to consistently just have adults talk about what they need, but it is the fact that as they live and walk and breathe and communicate, they are researchers. to train them in research pedagogy and methodology so that they can then cull these stories together, advocate for themselves and their communities, and do so alongside the credentialed individuals. Because I think one hand, it's important to find those gatekeepers, but you have young people walking the streets who are already griots in their communities, and if you teach them how to do this research methodology, then they actually will, in fact, not only show you what's possible, but then develop their own frameworks for how to make it possible and combat white supremacy in the process.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, so much to think about. Dylan, you want to comment on a few things regarding your youth?
Yeah, I think there's just so many different ways that youth voices can be raised up and to create policy change, create healing within their peer communities as well. At ACRS, Asian Counseling Referral Service, one of the methods and pathways we have available to people is for young people to lead in film projects. And so they are selecting the stories and topics that they are wanting to share with the world. And then the youth facilitators are able to provide some of the technical assistance and training to get those stories out. And I don't have the link with me right now, but I will definitely be sharing that out to make sure that we can lift up some of those the stories that young people have. One project I did work on was about specifically of them defining what healing looks like this was a small group of, I think, five youth leaders about what their definition of healing was. And I would like to continue to expand on that, hear from more people, hear from all your different programs, because I do think looking to the community, looking to like Keith was saying, not just to the gatekeepers, but to reaching out directly to young people to ask them, what do they want to do? What do they wish people knew? What system changes do they want to see?
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you. You know, we've been talking a lot about white supremacy and how that is part of the larger sort of framework as to why or how dehumanization is expressed, and particularly around the emotions of Black and brown folks. But there is a way in which even within our own communities, we dehumanize each other. Is that not right? And if that is the case, have you worked in terms of, in some of your spaces, how have you dealt or what solutions would you propose to disrupt dehumanization for people who look like us, but are differently us, have very different identities, who are gay or trans, or who choose partners that others of us might decide we shouldn't call family? Have you thought about this? Have you worked on this at all? Who would like to speak up? Mark?
Sure, I'll go. Yeah, this is probably one of the, I would say, almost the bigger thing that's kind of rotting from the inside out. And you know, there's a lot of systematic stuff set up, whether it be blood quantum, where you know, one is more Indian than the other, or more Native than the other, that we're having to deal with. I think the cultural legacy that left behind is that kind of self-hate, where we can walk around with an inner Trump within us, kind of hating bilaterally. And that's something that we probably focus more on now, more than even the outside stuff that's coming at us, but it's the inner stuff that we need to focus on. And within our work, that's one of the things that we've been more conscious of. And that could be just even within our own physical space, not necessarily within a social setting, but what are we putting into our own body at the dinner table, you know, and how can we change that with even our own diets and our own, how we handle ourselves? Because, you know, that whole self-hate is kind of there lingering often within even what we eat. So it's something that definitely we've made a conscious shift to really identify and understand, because it's what's really kind of holding us back more than I think even the outside stuff in our unification within our own community.
Thank you, Mark. Very important. Anyone else? Keith, you want to throw in?
Yeah. So one really powerful way that we do it is I think about a lot of these internal narratives, that this internalized racism, it breeds itself because there's often a lack of space for people to understand the systems that are pressing down on us, but the voices from those who are most impacted. So I'm reminded specifically, one of our partnerships, and we support our systems involved and impacted young people. And so we were working with young people who were court involved. And one of my awesome colleagues, Deco, she created a podcast where the young people were able to come in twice a week and tackle these larger conversations around the ways in which the justice system were not just, the ways in which school pushed them out. Also having these larger conversations around gun violence, like having a conversation around gun violence when you just finished yelling at the young people to put down the guns and then them stand up and say, but what makes you think I want to do this, is really powerful. But one cool thing that we found is that in analyzing all of these podcast episodes, do you want to know what the most powerful ingredient for this crazy learning was? Joy and laughter. Literally, when we coded every single podcast episode, the number one feature was the moments where the young people would be rapping on their own in the cipher, cracking jokes, or literally laughing. And so I think it is important for us to understand too that a valuable piece of resistance is the joy itself, and understanding that everyone has the right to joy. And all of our young people, especially those who are most vulnerable to these systems and their families, have that joy and should be able to wield that as its own form of resistance and superpower. But acknowledging too that in our education systems, that joy goes by another name: disrespect, willful defiance, a lack of learning. And the reality is that the young people are communicating in a way that is culturally sustaining and makes sense for them, and therefore producing a whole system of robust literacies that people don't even acknowledge.
Oh, that's great. We actually have someone just in a chat. One of our fellows has asked a question, and this could go along with the issue of within group or outside group dehumanization. How do you all use joy in your work? And thank you, Keith, for triggering that. As a form of resistance. Do you do that in a sense? And how do you do it? Dylan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that finding the joy, so yeah, we want to be able to recognize the injustices. We want to be able to recognize all the challenges and barriers that are there. But I think the most important work is we need to balance that of being able to create spaces and really low access barriers for ways that we can connect with youth. If even that's just playing basketball or coming in, just like having a after school hangout space for people to be able to connect with each other, and just know that it's safe for people to access that. And I don't actually remember who said this, but one of the quotes that stuck out to me when I was in school was that the work of a child is to play. And one of the things I think that gets lost because there's so many things that are fighting against us to allow that to happen. And so one of the things I think about is how can we get rid of the clutter and the barriers to make sure that people have space for joy and space for play. And I actually don't think that's limited to only to children and youth, but I think that for all of us is that we need to be able to find those spaces. Not separate spaces, but how we can integrate those spaces within our lives.
Yeah. I take it as a compliment when people call me childish and like to play too much. But in that sense, we have moved this conversation to joy. Anybody else want to think about joy in your work? Dr. Bryant, Rhonda?
So, I think about the use of music, as a way of sparking joy, or the use of cultural dance as a way of sparking joy. We often, when we talk about healing and when we think about emotional release, we don't, in Western society, they don't think about those kinds of things, but that's therapeutic for us as people of color, tapping into that rhythm and movement and all of that. And it's a form of freedom. Like, how free do you feel when you can dance and move and shake and, do karaoke like our fellows did last night? And that's important. And just because we live in a society that doesn't value our music or our dance does not mean that we should not still embrace it and use it as a part of what makes us feel free.
Right. Emotional expression, right? In all kinds of ways. Tashelle?
And I just want to say something because I don't want to be the rock in the pond. So we just because I'm so protective of like our ability to be able to have both. And I guess that is coming up too. I felt so often because our feelings get dehumanized and even punished, we end up with these double consciousness, right? Where we have to like, I don't know, oftentimes we end up just having to push through and pretend like we are not experiencing things. So I guess I want to say in the path to joy that we still rightfully reserve our right to feel. And if that feel has to come out in Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody to help you regulate yourself. I think of something else that I think is a combination of this too, Howard. You did an activity with the fellows once where you helped us think through, and I still use this because I think it's a combination of both acknowledging what is, because it's not healthy. Actually, black people in particular, we find in research tend to have more prolonged grief. One, because of, I would argue, in support of your model that we're dealing with ongoing dehumanization, but also because we have not also been given a chance to pause and say, no, that's really crappy what you just dealt with, because we all just trying to keep going, right? But we reserve the right to say, you know what, today I'm feeling kind of aggravated about what I'm seeing on TV, right? Or today I'm kind of upset that happened, or I'm feeling, and then also the space for joy. So I guess I want to just be protective of the space to acknowledge our emotions, to acknowledge that we get to feel anger and happiness, and we shouldn't be penalized, and to reserve that space. In addition to this space for joy. So really quickly, so I danced to Whitney Houston in the mirror, y'all. I Want to Dance with Somebody, we just performed last night, the fellows, on karaoke online, y'all. So I want to tell you, in COVID, you can still address your feelings, which we did, and then we also danced them out. So you can do all of that online. Okay. But Dr. Stevenson did this activity with us. It was like a 4-6 breathe through. I hope I'm doing this right. I might have revised it by accident. But you figure out when you're aggravated, it's an in the moment type of thing, right? So if you're at an 8, you have to think through what it takes to get you.
It's calculate, locate, communicate, breathe.
Yes.
So what feelings are you having on a scale of 1 to 10? Joy, sadness. Calculate, locate, where in your body do you feel it? The more specific you can be, the better you can handle it. Is it shoulders or is it your right shoulder? More specific. Communicate is, what is your self-talk? What are you saying to yourself during the moment? And self-imaging, what images, memories are you having in that moment? Breathing in 4 counts and out 6 counts. Although I bend to Dr. Hubbard's understanding in that particular area. But young people as young as 5th grade are able to use it on public transportation. They tell us, Doc, I calculated on SEPTA, that's Philly public transportation, and it got me through. So there's ways in which, yes, even young people can figure out what's happening to your body, your thoughts, and your feelings. And so, our hearts keep that trauma, our liver, our bodies. And so not to know it and not to say something about it, like you're saying, where can I tell somebody when I'm pissed? And in the language that I grew up with around the dinner table, and not have to shapeshift myself to make other people feel okay.
Yeah. And you can do it in the moment. That's the thing. It's tried and true, y'all. I've been in meetings, I've done it. So I went from like an 8 to like, I got this, my ideas still matter, and so it didn't erase what you're feeling. That's the main thing. It's like we've been taught to erase, like we're not feeling that, and we do start to internalize it. But no, you do feel this. We're gonna regulate for this meeting, and it reminds you you're taking care of yourself at the same time. And yes, Dr. Phyllis Hubbard, please go check out her website. Can I highlight one other strength of Black families and people of color actually? In the narrative is that there's a lot of misinformation that we don't talk to our kids because we're so authoritarian with them. I want to highlight that we do that to protect our kids, right? From further harm by saying, do what I say, please. But we do talk to our kids. And in fact, I know through my research and other people have found that a lot of communication happens in the home front about dehumanization. So that is another major strength of Black families, I want to say in particular, that's my area, that there are high levels of communication. And I don't know, Rhonda, you have a son. I mean, would you say you talk to your kid? And that's another form of like, it's not like she's sitting down and have a therapy moment with him, but I'm sure, and you have a daughter, right? Would you have an example of that? Because I think that's powerful too in terms of resistance and how you have to model the toughness and the joy for them to copy. Like, and I see a lot of smiling pictures of your kids, so I'm thinking of you. What would you say? And
you know, we have to have these conversations with our children. You know, my son and I in particular have been talking a lot recently about how you release emotions effectively in the face of all of these things that are happening in society. So, you know, he's 15, has a learner's permit, about to start driving. I have all kinds of anxieties as a mother of a Black son who's 6'3", about to get behind the wheel of a car. And I have to recognize that sometimes my anxieties steal the joy out of a typical teenage moment where he's excited about learning to drive. But the important thing is that I express to him, you know, I apologize if I stole some joy from this moment. This is the reason why, and this was what was going through my head in that moment. But I want to rebalance this for you. I want you to be excited about this milestone, but I also want you to understand that you have to protect yourself. And so these are the things that we're going to do in the car to make sure that you're protecting yourself. And so I'm always trying to walk that balance. But then when we get back home after the driving experience, now let's celebrate. You know, you did a great job. You did a great left turn. You did this, you know, but it is a continual like being very mindful. And I think what we have to understand is that when we are operating in a space of stress as people of color, parents need the tools to understand how to become that mindful. Because oftentimes parents are just so focused on the distress part because they haven't been given the tools. So how can we give them the tools so that they can dial back their own distress and have that conversation with their kids?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. In so many respects, this conversation about emotions and emotional dehumanization has been triggering for us, even as we're talking about it. We get information on what to do, and it also brings emotion to us to even take in that information. Now that we have still maybe a little bit more time left, I'm going to ask our panelists to consider some of the call to actions. This is where our audience, and please send in more questions to our audience if you can send it on up to us. But what would you say if you had to give people some really clear, direct strategies, call to action about what they should be doing to address the emotional dehumanization of boys, young men of color? And I think you can include even those who they call family, however they define family, are family. What about them too, right? And this call to action, you can have one or two. If we have enough time, we'll go around a second time. So just state one, and then we'll move ourselves around. I'm going to give our panelists a little time and ask Rhonda if you want to go first as co-partner, director, you. Sure. What thoughts do you have about what's a call to action that you would give our audience about emotional dehumanization in boys, young men of color?
Be deliberate about giving boys and young men of color spaces for joy.
Be deliberate. Thank you. Dylan.
All right, I'm gonna think about that. I think the call to action is asking for what you need, and asking, and not just asking, demanding for what you need. So if that's in the school setting or in a hospital setting, whatever. And I think there's ways to do this where we're not being shut down or feeling that we're not going to be fearful of any repercussions about how we're asking or demanding these things. But I think that's the number one most important thing, is demanding for what we need to heal and thrive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll leave it open for the rest of my panelists who want to go. To Shell?
Speaking specifically to allies, non-people of color, get the training that would that would allow you to be the support that you wish to be in reaching people of youth, boys and young men of color. If you participated today, I'm proud of you. On your way.
Thank you. Thank you. Mark or Keith? Keith?
So 3 really quick things. 1, understand and learn and be trained around the language of trauma. Mm-hmm. 1, I think is super important. 2, let your boys and girls and young boys and girls of color, let them cry and play often at the same time. I think holding this idea around the fact that trauma and healing is a both and concept, which I learned from Howard, right? It's really essential, because when Black and brown and when youth of color play, they heal. But I think part of that playing process is it prepares you to live and how to exist and survive and to thrive. But holding space for that full humanity, to be able to cry, to be able to cuss, to be able to dance it out, to be able to hit a punching bag, all those things being valid is super important. So I always keep saying to our young people and their families, being able to do that all together, play and cry.
Okay. Mark.
Yes, Keith. Yes, I was thinking this whole time about the joy. And that's one of the things that we really strive to do is to be vulnerable, is to cry and to play. And in the text box I put, they went to like tears of sorrow. We've had sessions of just tears of sorrow that just flipped. Those tears went to tears of joy, and into the dancing mode. You know what I mean? And that's, I think that's where we're taking it. You know, that's where we're taking it. And for the allies, like what Tashelle said, get the training. Like now, there's been a lot of folks requesting, to be allies, and I'm saying, get the cultural sensitivity training, get out of the comfort zone, and look into and how to down. But the joy, the joy. That's what's up. The more of the celebration, the call of action is to celebrate each other, to flood social media with more positive images, and to celebrate, really celebrate each other. That's what I'm trying to do right now, personally, with all of our social media platforms, is just continue to pronounce the great stories that are out.
Thank you, Mark. Guess what? We're gonna, and folks are taking down these call to actions. We got enough time. We're gonna have a round 2 on the call to action. And this time I'm gonna pose a question that was given to us from Richard Smith, one of our fellows around some communities, Black and brown communities, are experiencing uptick in interpersonal violence. Can you suggest, call to action, keep it brief, any response to if you've seen that, or suggestions you might have to solutions, I guess, or thoughts? Call to action, keep it brief.
So Howard, I think the issue around this violence between Black and brown communities is based on accepting the narrative that whites have created rather than learning the narrative for yourself. So if you accept the narrative of who Native Americans are, and they accept the narrative of who Black people are, that's been given by mainstream society, then of course there's going to be a clash. So take the time to do your own research, build your own relationships, and learn directly from those communities. And I think people will begin to see that there is more commonality and there is more mutual respect that way than just accepting what's out in the atmosphere about folk, because that is what creates the violence. And so the solution is for us to look to build together and to understand each other.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Quick.
Richard,
thanks for your question. More jobs, A lot of this violence is connected to Black youth. Disproportionately, they're less likely to be hired, and they're the first to be fired in COVID, and we know that through research. The other deal is violence tends to be, in addition to everything Rhonda just said, I'm gonna do the other piece of it. Is violence tends to be concentrated in certain areas in which we've been redlined. So whenever I hear internalized, I still want you to never forget that external layer. These Black youth and youth of color didn't just start. They didn't wake up and say, I'm gonna kill another person who looks like me. Although some of it's internalized, let's please keep in mind that system surrounding them in which Black and brown communities have been redlined on purpose. Drugs were put there on purpose. And so getting them outside of those communities where they can see and imagine. I want to come really, really back to Keith's video, which I think was really powerful. Keith did a lot of things that I'm mentioning at Deep Center, and that is take them outside of the environment, help them reimagine the spaces that they're in, and show them examples of people who have survived and what their route was to success. If all you have in your community, if your community has been planted with all of these infestations of guns and everything else, then those are the tools and then you're at low resource schools. Again, I'm not trying to say that we're not responsible for our own challenges, but I still, there's a little resistance from me, I can tell you through research and what we know. There are a lot of systemic things that have to shift, which again is the impetus for Forward Promise. More books in schools, lower teacher turnover rate, all of those things will stop the brown. And one final thing I want to note is that crime is always concentrated. People who operate in violence are always racially similar to each other. So quite frankly, although we don't know it, white on white crime is very similar in terms of homicide. And gun violence, they're more likely to die by suicide. We're more likely to die by homicide. It's a mental health issue when it's suicide. It's these crazy Black kids who are out of control when it's homicide. So I want you to keep that in mind. And the news focuses on Black and Latino offenders and less on the victim. So just keep in mind there's a lot of media distortion around this, and that we also see rates of violence among white populations that doesn't get highlighted. So I just wanted to throw in those other systemic pieces. And I'm done. I just had to, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Tishelle. Anybody else want to come? Keith?
Yeah, so I'll say real quickly.
Sure. You got 2 minutes.
Be guided by culture. I think one of the most profound things, we've done a lot of transformative community conferencing in our community, and it's healing, understanding, always happens at the intersection of culture. Food, like actual community. The reality is that we have within our cultures already medicine, but somehow internalized racism has tricked us to believe that it is each other's fault for why we are here instead of looking at the larger systems. And so what we do is during our hardest conversations, we first connect through culture, through food, through collective storytelling to know who we are, how we got here. And then together we culturally weave in these dreams of what we can be. It sounds very woo-woo and very mushy. I think there needs to be enough more of that, right? But it's also surgical activism and advocacy from the ground and the cultures most impacted, because those who are closest to the problem are the closest to the solution.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Fantastic. You know, we have a little time, and I guess the thing I would throw out this time, round 3, just one sentence that would address in your mind how we should feel hopeful about the future of our communities. One sentence. Who want to go first? Yeah, I'm gonna have to cut you off.
I can kick it off.
I
can kick it off really quick since I can only see me. We are more than what has happened to us.
Thank you. Great job. Beautiful. We are more than whatever's happened to us. I know you're thinking about it. I can see it in your head.
So the one thing I'm feeling just hopeful about is the fact that we're all here together right now, and that we have other people who are participating and watching this through the webcast, and so that is a huge shining light for me and being able to remain hopeful. In terms of next steps, I'm just going to reiterate what has already been brought up, is continue to cultivate that allyship. It's not just one workshop or one webcast, or it's something that we need to take out to talk to our families, talk to our friends, and even people that maybe we don't even know, and to reach across and build that bridge.
Thank you, Dylan. All right, Mark, you got it.
This is a forward promise.
Okay, all right. You be brief. Rhonda.
We have the power and the leadership in our communities to transform.
Okay. And I'm just
Go
going to say,
Michelle.
Faith gives me hope.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. I just want to say you all have been fantastic. And I want to say to our audience, we have talked, we have gone through a range of emotions, not only in us, in our own bodies as panelists, but and hearing the stories and retracing our experiences. We've gone from inner Trump to joy unspeakable to a host of range of possibilities. And I'm glad to hear that you all have given us some words. My sort of call to action would be trusting what we started, and that is to embrace the genius in our own communities. For those of you who are out there, we want you to fill out the link that will appear on the screen about the post event reflections. What did you think about today and what you heard? I want to announce that our next episode that's coming up in 2 weeks, on October 20th at 12 p.m., Tuesday, October 20th, is going to focus on physical dehumanization. No more hashtags disrupting the dehumanization of our bodies, right? And so we'll be here with new panelists. Some of our panelists today kind of eked into the physical, but that's absolutely okay. That's what we'll see next week. And I'm going to go one more time. Any final words for our panelists that you want to share before we have to say bye-bye? I think I've squeezed it entirely out of you. So to our audience, thank you. To our fellows who are listening, bless you. And we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks.